All right, welcome to the Earth Part 2. We are starting today on a sketch because we're going to talk about human productivity. And in order to talk about this function that plants do, it's important to review or go over for the first time, if you've never thought about it that much, the basic anatomy of plants and how they go about doing their major physiological processes. So here we have a tree, basic plant. It has roots that are underground. This is soil. This is the lower atmosphere or air. And the plant is going to have its leaves, major body organ, that is going to be up here in the air. And the major function of the leaves is going to be to do photosynthesis. Right? I'm going to abbreviate photosynthesis PSN. Right? That's the job of the leaves. Photosynthesis is going to be a process that's going to take carbon dioxide into the leaves from the air, and it's going to release oxygen into the air from the leaves. And so this is the opposite of the process of cellular respiration, which is going to use oxygen and produce carbon dioxide. As plants are doing photosynthesis, it turns out they also need water. Now they're going to be absorbing that water from the soil, and they're going to be moving it up through their bodies. And as they're doing the photosynthesis, the water is going to evaporate from their leaves. We'll come back later to talk about plant physiology. It's a fascinating process how they do this. They don't have any muscles. They don't have a heart that pumps their body fluids like animals do. They're able to move this water up through their body, even to the tops of the highest trees, just using the principles of physics. So this process is going to allow plants to do photosynthesis because water is part of the chemical reaction. It's going to allow them to replenish the water in their bodies that is lost due to this evaporation. So this whole process of moving the water from the roots up through the trunk and into the leaves, and the fact that it evaporates from the leaves, it's called evapotranspiration. Right? Perspiration is what people do when we exercise. We perspire or we sweat. And this evapotranspiration is sort of like plant sweat. Right? And the reason the water is leaving the leaves is because it's evaporating. It's changing from the liquid state to the gas state and moving into the air around the plant. Okay, so the other thing that plants are going to be getting from the soil is nutrients. So when we come back to talk about plant physiology, it's really important to the plant that there are all the nutrients that it needs in the soil around it. All right, so we were talking about biomes before, and the process that plants are doing, moving this water up through their bodies, because it's part of this process of photosynthesis, the amount of rainfall in any region is going to in large part affect how much photosynthesis is done in that area. So just reminding ourselves that this important process in plant physiology is required for plants to do it. Now we're going to switch gears back to some slides. All right, we are in part 2 of the Earth lecture, and we're going to cover this primary productivity and energy section and these biogeochemical cycles. All right, so we just finished talking about biomes, and the reason why we were talking about plant sweat is because of this graph. this is another way that we can look at differences between biomes, not because of the environment that they're in, but by the amount of photosynthesis that's happening. So there's a couple of factors that contribute to the amount of total photosynthesis. How much plant there is in that environment. So if you imagine the three-dimensional space that plants take up in each of these habitats, whereas if you look down at tropical rainforest, you're going to be seeing basically nothing but tree canopy if you fly over it. So it has a tremendous amount of physical volume or space that plants are filling up. Whereas if you look at desert or scrubland or tundra, you scraped all the plant up over the same amount, square kilometer or something, you would get much less. There's actually spaces between the plants are much smaller. So we're going to use a term to describe how much plant there is in the environment, or how much of anything really, called biomass, right? So imagine if we cut down all the plants, scraped them all up, put them on a big balance, and we measured their mass. That's what biomass is. It's just how much living stuff there is, right? So biomass is going to be differing between these different habitats. And the other thing that's going to be important based on our interest in ecology is how much photosynthesis. There may be more biomass, but are those plants really doing more photosynthesis? Are they turning more carbon dioxide into glucoses and storing them in their bodies? So we're going to measure that photosynthesis, and we're going to call it primary productivity. So primary productivity is because they're primary producers, right? Plants are at the bottom of that food web, and they're going to produce biomass, right? And that's turning carbon dioxide into glucoses and actually building their bodies out of them. We're going to measure primary productivity as grams carbon per meter squared per year. And so this grams is specifically referring to carbons, right? Because we're fixing carbons, that is turning them from gas molecule, carbon dioxide, into a solid molecule that's available for other living things to use, right? So changing from carbon dioxide into glucose is fixing the carbon, or changing it from a gas to a solid, basically. So we're going to use a measure of area in order to standardize this measurement. And then we're also going to look across a whole year, because different habitats are going to have different amounts of photosynthesis happening in different years. Tropical forest, it might be the same year round, but in a temperate forest, remember, those trees are all going to go to sleep during the winter. They're not going to be doing any photosynthesis. And so if you remember, we were looking at global atmosphere and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you see those little annual wiggles up and down in that carbon dioxide graph as it's going from year to year. Those are plants in the northern hemisphere sleeping, resting during winter, not doing photosynthesis, and then waking up and being busy doing photosynthesis during the spring and summer. All right, so we see that as evapotranspiration goes up, net primary productivity goes up, and just based on the biomass that we see in these environments, it correlates very strongly with the amount of primary productivity that's happening, right? So instead of looking at rainfall, though, we're looking at actual evapotranspiration measured in millimeters of water per year. And that's how much water is being moved from the soil into the atmosphere. And that water has to be there because of rainfall in the environment for the plants to be able to access it. All right, so when we start thinking about what happens to the plant material, so we have at the base of our food web, we have primary producers, and then that plant matter is eaten by a consumer. So imagine we have a caterpillar, And it's going to eat a certain amount of energy. So remember, we can measure energy in joules or calories. Those are measures of heat, but it's also energy that's stored in those molecules. So imagine that the caterpillar eats 200 joules of energy from this plant leaf. It turns out there's 3 different ways that the caterpillar is using that material. And in fact, about half of it actually passes through the body, doesn't get absorbed or turned into usable energy at all by the animal. So it just passes out of the body as fecal matter, right? So poop. So that energy is being removed from the tree. It's being returned to the environment where it's going to be, put onto the soil, and the material is going to be decomposed, and those nutrients are going to be returned to the soil. So it isn't gone from the ecosystem. It just doesn't go into the body of the caterpillar, right? Some of the energy, right, that we take in every day is used to run our bodies. It requires energy for us to do muscular contractions. It requires energy for us to pump ions from one side of cell membranes to the other. A lot of our work that our brains and our kidneys and all of our other body organs are doing is actually pumping ions from one side, or in our gut, digesting energies needed to do the chemical reactions that build the enzyme molecules that we use to digest our food. So cells are busy doing work. So just to stay alive, even if we aren't exercising, just to stay alive, we're going to have a portion of the food that we eat, the energy is going to go to cellular respiration. So we're going to use the glucose molecules, turn them into ATPs, and then use that energy for life processes. Our caterpillar is a juvenile individual, so it's still growing. So there's going to be some part of the biomass of the food that it eats that's going to be turned into caterpillar, right? So when we look at what happens to the energy that's stored in the plant matter, how much of it goes from being plant biomass into being animal biomass? Well, it's only the material that is stored in the body of the caterpillar. So it takes in plant leaf, breaks down those molecules, rearranges them, builds new caterpillar body parts, builds new exoskeleton, builds new muscle tissue. So that turns into caterpillar biomass, right? So we want to see that only a small fraction of the plant biomass gets turned into animal biomass, because the rest of it is either used as energy and not used as materials, or it's passed out as waste. All right, so this slide shows there's about a 200 joules to 33 joules proportion of that. But overall, in the ecosystem, we can summarize the amount of energy that's passed from one level of consumer to the next as about a factor of 10 is how much it's decreased at every step. So if we go from primary producers in the environment to primary consumers, we go from 10,000 joules of biomass of plant to turns into only about 1,000 joules of primary consumer. And so every step we go up the food web, we're losing 90%, only keeping 10% of the biomass. Right. And there's a gap as well in efficiency between the sunlight that's coming in and the plant biomass that's built from it. Right. So this energy is coming in from the sun. We don't get it. The vast majority of energy that's used in ecosystems is going to be coming from the sunlight, not coming from chemoheterotrophs. And so energy has to keep coming into the system, right? So we lose it at every step. Some of it is used, right? Some of it's stored, but we just keep losing it, right? So we have to keep getting more energy from the sun. Fortunately, our sun is going to be around for a good long time, and that isn't a problem. Right. So we've already looked at this idea that we're going to get energy from the sun, and that it's going to move through but get lost as we go through these different levels of consumer. So this diagram is showing that process, but it's adding to it, right? Adding to it, all the red arrows are energy. It's adding to it what's happening to the nutrients or the molecules or the chemicals, right? So there's two different things that are moving through the ecosystem: energy and matter, right? So matter is going to be anything that has volume and takes up space. So basically anything that's made of atoms and molecules, right? Energy is this, sort of philosophical thing that doesn't have mass or take up space, right? So all of the energy that's coming in to our ecosystem is going to come from the sun, right? So the sun, this is an external resource. Basically, we think of the Earth, the biosphere, as a relatively closed system, right? Most of, in terms of matter, right? We don't have very much. There's a little bit. Don't worry about that little bit. There's a little bit that might be flying off into space, the odd, ozone molecule that we lose from the upper atmosphere. And there's the occasional asteroid that comes in, right? But the vast, vast, vast majority of all the molecules that we have on Earth are here, have been here, are going to be here. Right? So closed system from the perspective of matter, but an open system from the perspective of energy, right? The energy is coming in from the sun, and actually some of it is leaving as heat as well, right? So we're going to have something happening with energy, right? It's going to get passed from the bodies of producers to consumers, secondary to tertiary consumers, et cetera, et cetera. Notice that at every step, some of it's being lost as heat. Even plants are losing a little bit of energy as heat. They have to take those glucose molecules and turn them into ATPs. That process always loses a little heat. In fact, if you have a very sensitive infrared device, you can see that plants are a little bit warmer than the environment around them, right? So there's always, this is one of our laws of thermodynamics, that no chemical energy transformation is 100% efficient, that we're always going to be losing some, all right? So we're losing energy as heat. All right, what's going on with these other groups on here that we haven't seen before? So we have these secondary consumers, primary tertiary consumers. All of these are kinds of plants and animals. And what's going to happen to them is that they're going to die, or parts of them are going to fall off, and they're going to produce waste products. So if you imagine a forest or a chaparral region, there's leaves that are going to drop off. Sometimes a branch gets broken off of a tree. Animals are going to be coming through. They're going to be pooping and peeing. You might have some fur that comes off. They're going to leave bits of their food. A mouse is going to eat the seeds and leave some of the husks laying around. A coyote is going to eat a rabbit, but it's going to leave the fur and the bones. And so those will be laying, or little tidbits of its mass are going to be left over. Right, so all that stuff that's laying around, it's kind of fallen onto the ground, that's dead or decaying, is going to be considered this word detritus. Right, detritus is sort of leftover trash that's fallen. If you've got a bunch of food wrappers and empty water bottles on the floor of your car, that's detritus. This is stuff that's fallen and it's left over and it's piling up there. All right. Now, some of this matter is going to continue to be broken down, and the remaining energy that's used in it is going to be used by detritivores. So we have herbivores eat plants, detritivores eat detritus. And bacteria and fungi are major components of that part of the ecosystem. So things that live in soil, worms, insects, roly-polies, anything that's going to be eating that broken down, decaying organic matter, right? So those tidbits are going to get broken down into even smaller tidbits. And basically, this process is going to end up remineralizing or recycling all of the atoms and molecules that were left over in the body parts of those plants and animals and in their fecal matter and other waste products. It's going to go back into the soil. So when we're talking about a terrestrial ecosystem, everything goes into the soil. Remember, the plants are getting the nutrients out of the soil. In a marine ecosystem, basically all this stuff falls down to the bottom, right? And it lays there in the sediment. Okay, so same thing is happening in the marine ecosystem, that we tend to talk about it as being in the sediment, not in the soil. And then we have to get the sediment mixed up with water flow in order to return those nutrients to the shallow water where the sunlight is, so that the single-celled phytoplankton can absorb those nutrients and be able to do photosynthesis. Right. So we have kind of this very complicated looking diagram, but I'm going to redraw it for you briefly. And one thing that bothers me about this diagram is that it has this big blue arrow going around the whole outside. And that's a little confusing. I don't understand what they mean by that. So one thing about these diagrams in the textbook is sometimes they're real nice, sometimes they're a little confusing. So I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to redraw this diagram for you to help you kind of clarify what are the things that are important and things that are not important. Right? But basically, the take-home message is that nutrients, atoms and molecules, are temporarily stored in the bodies of living things. They get recycled into the soil by the processes of death and decomposition. Right, and then they go back into the primary producers from where they are passed on, right? So any nutrient molecule, say iron, that's absorbed by a primary producer and stored in its body, when a primary consumer eats it, that's how it's getting its iron, right? So for any molecule or atom of interest, we're going to see that it is recycled. Okay, so matter gets recycled. Energy is coming from outside the ecosystem. It's coming from the sun. It's temporarily used and stored in the bodies of our plants and animals and other living things, but it's always eventually lost as heat, and we have to keep getting more. Okay. All right. So slightly different version of this diagram for you. Share my screen. So I like to draw the sun over here. Here's the sun. Don't forget the sun. And what is it contributing? It is contributing energy. Right? So I don't have different colors here, but I'm going to use E for energy and N for nutrients. All right. Who is getting this energy from the sun? It's plants. All right. Plants get eaten by animals. And plants are going to get energy, or sorry, animals are going to get energy from the plants. They're also going to get nutrients from the plants. All right, now where are plants getting their nutrients from? Let's put that on here too. Soil, right? Plants are getting nutrients from soil. They're not getting energy from soil, right? So each of these boxes, plants and animals, are living things. They have to get energy from somewhere. They have to get nutrients from somewhere, right? Plants get them from two different places, the sun and soil. Animals get both their nutrients and their energy from eating plants. All right, now plants are going to be losing some energy as heat. Animals are going to be losing some energy as heat. And when plants and animals die, right, they're going to go to this detritus compartment. Right. And there's going to be some little leftover energy and nutrients that are going to be going with their body parts into the detritus, right? If there wasn't any leftover stuff going in there, the detritivores wouldn't have anything to eat. All right, so the detritus and then the detritivores are going to be basically getting the rest of the energy out of it. And what ends up going into the soil is just the nutrients, right? The system is pretty efficient, that there's going to be all the energy is gone by the time it gets to the soil. All right, so we'll put a little loss of energy over here. Right. If you've ever had a compost pile, one of the things about them that's a little creepy is they get hot because the breakdown of that last little bit of molecules that are in your coffee grounds and your rotting tomatoes and whatever you're putting in your compost pile. If you have a nice, active, healthy compost pile, it'll get warm, right? And so that's where this energy is being released from those molecules, right? So we have some parts of this diagram that are showing nutrients, right? So nutrients cycle and recycle, right? Energy comes in from the outside, but eventually is lost, right? So that's when we're generalizing and we're talking about any kind of matter, right? We're going to turn our attention now to say, okay, there's all those different elements that are on the periodic table. What happens to different ones? How do they move through the environment? So it turns out that when we look out in the world, there's rocks, there's soil, there's ice, there's all these other components of the ecosystem, those physical parts of the ecosystem that are not living things, right? And that they are going to be places where we find a lot of these molecules, right? So we want to think about the amount of carbon that there is accessible to life. We have to consider the carbons that are stored in these other ways in the ecosystem. And so this is where we get into talking about something that sounds really fancy, which is biogeochemical cycles. All right. When I was a student, I thought these biogeochemical cycles were the most boring thing imaginable. Make sure you are seeing my screen. Okay, looks like that's working. All right, so biogeochemicals, the most boring thing imaginable, right? But since we have become exceedingly concerned about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that is a major part of the biogeochemical cycle for carbon, right? So the carbon cycle has become, dare say, almost even sexy. Okay, maybe not, at least interesting, of interest. So when we talk about all of the different kinds of atoms and molecules we find in the world, right, we're going to find them in two ways for two things. Okay, so we've got 4 boxes on this diagram. Places where we find these molecules out in the environment, we're going to call reservoirs. Right? Reservoirs is just a fancy word of saying a place where we find this stuff. We can move things from one reservoir to another. So reservoirs may be physical locations, they may be types of materials. We can move atoms and molecules from one compartment to another by a process, right? Some of these processes are biological, some of these processes are physical and chemical. So we have 2 kinds of molecules: organic molecules. Organic molecules are molecules containing carbons and at least 1 hydrogen, whereas inorganic molecules are going to either not contain any carbons at all, or they're going to contain carbons but without any hydrogens. Okay, so carbon dioxide is an inorganic material. So that's important to remember. All right, so if we're thinking about carbons, we may find them in some of these compartments, not all of these compartments, but this is a generalized idea of where we're going to find, and if we look at all the different biogeochemical cycles, this is a summary of all of the things that could happen to any kind of molecule. So when we look at one particular molecule, not all these things are going to happen, and then sometimes other things are going to happen too. But these are the most important processes. All right, so we also have this idea of whether materials are available or they're unavailable, right? If they're available as nutrients, that basically means that in some way living things have access to them. So they need to be a kind of molecule that the living thing can take in and use. And they also need to be physically accessible. So where we have molecules in the very high atmosphere that's above where any life lives, they're inaccessible or unavailable. Where we have things that are deeply buried in the sediment, deeply buried under rock formations, they are not available. Right? So they're either a molecule that is not possible to be used, or they are physically inaccessible. All right. So these processes, a lot of different kinds of atoms are stored as minerals in rocks, right? So a lot of the kinds of things that we need as just tiny little amounts, we actually find those stored in rocks. So if we think about all the rock that there is on the planet, then that's a lot of minerals. As rock is formed, right, over long periods of geologic time, we can move materials, atmosphere, soil, and water. So we're going to have, possibly water molecules, different materials that are in the soil, different gases. They can get mixed into and then pressed or compressed with lots of heat and time into rock, right? So we can form sedimentary rock. That is one process that can move things from available inorganic materials to unavailable. Right? It's available if you can lick it up. It's unavailable if it's stored in a rock, and if you lick it, nothing comes off. Now, rocks don't live forever. As they are exposed to the atmosphere, to water, to wind, to friction from like little particles hitting them, those little surface of it gets weathered or eroded off. And when those particles are small enough, the atoms and molecules that are at their surface can get dissolved and get moved back into the soil and made available. Right? So we have these processes. We can form rock, and we can then release those minerals from rocks. These happen over long periods of time. If we're going to move materials from inorganic into organic, we have two processes here. Photosynthesis we've already talked about. That's going to turn carbon dioxides into glucoses. And that'll become part of the bodies of living things. Assimilation is a word that means getting incorporated into, right? So a plant is going to take up some iron, right? It's going to put it into a biological molecule. And in this case, it's actually the photosynthetic pigment. When animals eat that, they can absorb the iron from that molecule. All right, so that's another way that other nutrients, basically any atom besides carbons get moved from the soil by plants and then into molecules that other animals can use. All right. Organic materials available as nutrients. We're going to count the bodies of living things in this box as well. All right. When the bodies of living things, carbon-based life forms built mainly of glucose-based or carbon-based molecules die, fall to the bottom of the ocean, or pile up in low oxygen environments over long periods of historical geologic time, they can become fossilized, right? So the process of fossilization for organic molecules is going to, with pressure and with time, convert them from these ring forms into more straight chain molecules. And these are the things that we consider fossil fuels. Right? So coal, oil, peat, which is a kind of oily, matted vegetation and soil. They are rich in this combustible material, right? So remember that glucose is sugar, right? And that we do a combustion reaction in order to burn it for calories in our bodies, and that these other molecules are going to take that same energy that's stored in those glucose molecules and convert them into these longer chain molecules. To become fossilized, they usually have to be deeply buried. All right, so these are unavailable as nutrients, not necessarily because they can't be used, but because they're physically inaccessible. All right, when these molecules are burnt, right, they turn the carbons into carbon dioxides. That chemical reaction of combustion, just like cellular respiration, is going to turn those long chain carbon molecules into carbon dioxides and water. All right, so burning fossil fuels is going to put these molecules into this inorganic molecule matter available as nutrients reservoir. And then also, as we have living things doing their life processes, respiration is going to return carbon dioxides to the atmosphere. Decomposition, excretion, those are things we talked about in the energy versus nutrients slide, but those are also going to be breakdown reactions where we return those, break apart the carbons in the glucose molecules, use the energy stored in them, turn them back into carbon dioxides. Okay, so this is a very, very big picture. It doesn't talk about one specific atom that we would be interested in looking at its special biogeochemical cycle. It's called biogeochemical because there's processes that are done by living things. There's processes that are done as geologic things, and there's processes that are done as chemical reactions, okay? All right, so not only can we look at specific atoms, but we can also look at really important molecules like water, right? This diagram is another fancy diagram from your textbook that looks like we just have this big swirling thing of water moving around. It's flowing different directions. We're not really sure what's happening here. So I'm going to redraw this diagram for you too. This water cycle, right, is going to be an example of a biogeochemical cycle. And one of the things that's interesting in the water cycle is actually we have transport. We sort of have geographic transport or flow of water moving from one place to the other. So we're going to have major compartments or major reservoirs, places where we find water. And then we're going to see what are the processes or things that happen that move water in between these reservoirs, right? So in the last diagram, we had boxes. I'm going to redraw this diagram for you also with boxes. All right, so if we think about all the places that we find water out in the world, the oceans is the place where we find the most water, and it's salt water. When we're going to talk about all of the fresh water that's on the planet, we're going to lump together lakes, rivers, streams, right? We're trying to look at this super duper big picture. And so the fresh water is going to be, we're going to call it surface water. And it's important to make this distinction because when we're talking about water, it turns out there's another place where we can find it, and that is groundwater. And this is subsurface water. So when we talk about when we have a well, right, and we're pumping water up from below the ground, it's basically there are underground caves or underground rivers where we're going to find these large reservoirs of water. And in some areas, we get all of our water from this groundwater, or aquifers, as we call them. In other places, we get our water from surface water. Groundwater is being pumped faster than it's being replenished in a lot of places. And so as we're talking about water moving forward in the human experience, it will be increasingly important to conserve water and make sure we're getting the water that we need. In Southern California, it's a big issue. You've probably heard about it. All right, because we're biologists, we also want to put a biotic compartment, and the vast majority of the water that we find in the environment in living thing is going to be in plants. We could put animals over here. For the moment, I'm gonna just put plants on the diagram because as you'll see as we keep talking about these, we can make, so we could put animals over here. I'm gonna leave it off. Okay, so when we're drawing these diagrams, there's sort of one version of it that includes every single possible place where we can find water. But sometimes for simplicity, just to make sure we understand what's most important, we may not put all of those. For example, on my diagram, I'm not going to put glaciers and ice caps just because those don't involve life, and the amount of water that's moving into and out of them is fairly small. All right, we'll come back and talk about this more on an in-class activity that we'll do live. All right, so remember, we're not only talking about frozen water and liquid water, but gaseous water, or water that is water vapor, and we find that in the atmosphere. All right, the other place we want to put on our diagram is soil, right? We're going to have moist soil. So the water that's in the soil is going to be something we want to account for. And the other reason we want to put it on here is because that's how water gets from into plants, right? So all of our boxes, we want to have at least one arrow going into them and at least one arrow going out of them, right? So we got to have a way for each of our boxes to get the water. All right, so we're going to have water vapor in the atmosphere, and we're going to have liquid water in all of these other places. I'm going to put some terms on here, and some of them may be new to you. So, but some of them will be easy, right? Okay, so the way that water is going to get from oceans to the atmosphere and from surface water to the atmosphere is regular old evaporation. You know, it's a hot day, water molecules are going to rise up off the surface of the ocean and off the surface of lakes and streams. We're going to get water into the oceans from the atmosphere, into the surface water from the atmosphere. The opposite of evaporation is going to be precipitation. Right? Just like when you have a precipitate in your chemical reaction, it's a solid that falls down onto the bottom. We can also have precipitation of liquids, right? So we have water molecules that go from being in the gas state to being in the liquid state. All right, that's condensation. Basically, that's clouds when you see them in the sky. And then once they turn into liquid water, they sort of do, you know, a Wile E. Coyote thing and are like, ah, now I'm falling. All right, so first we have condensation, and then we have precipitation, the falling of the water out of the sky. All right, so we're also going to have precip. And over the ice caps, snow also counts as precipitation. We're going to have rain falling onto the soil as well. We can have evaporation from soil into the atmosphere, but it's a smaller amount than from oceans and surface waters. And so I'm not going to put it on here. All right, so we've gotten water into and out of the oceans. We've gotten water into and out of the surface water. There's another place that water can go from the surface waters and also from the soil. And that is, it can actually flow by gravity down through soil or through openings in rocks, cracks in rocks, and it's going to end up in the groundwater, right? So this process is called percolation. Percolation is like trickling through a solid. So actually we used to talk about coffee being percolated because we're taking that boiling water and we're letting it dribble down through the coffee grounds. That's basically exactly what happens when it rains on soil. The soil particles are like the coffee grounds. The water trickles down through them and it flows until it reaches an impermeable layer, becomes part of the groundwater if there is a reservoir available. If not, then it's going to keep flowing downhill. And so surface waters, rivers and lakes, lakes and streams are going to move eventually into the oceans by flow. Right? It's just going to go downhill. All right, so we're getting water into the oceans from all of these processes as well. The last part of our water cycle is how we're going to move water from soil to plants, and then we're going to have plants to the atmosphere. Plants to the atmosphere has that special word, evapotranspiration. And then movement from soil to plants. We can call it a couple different things. We can call it uptake. We can call it absorption. Whichever word you prefer. All right. So again, an important component of biogeochemical cycles is that every box needs to have at least one way for things to go into it and go out of it. And that we have captured the most important of the reservoirs that are out there, but maybe not every single one. And the most important things that cause movement between these different containers or compartments. All right, so another way to think about these is that the things that are in these boxes, these are nouns, whereas the things that are happening to move them from one compartment to another are verbs, or they have, they have involved movement. All right. Now there's a biogeochemical cycle for every atom. Some are more important than others for biology. We're going to finish up by talking about one of the other cycles that is so important to life, and that is the carbon cycle. So that's our last topic for this lecture. And again, we have a fancy picture from the textbook that's showing plants and animals, some important things we already talked about from the diagram showing the difference between how energy and nutrients move through the ecosystem. We've got cellular respiration moving carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We've got photosynthesis pulling it out of the atmosphere. We've got burning of fossil fuels moving carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We've got an oceanic component here. We've got primary consumers, higher level consumers, some mysterious stuff going on over here. But this diagram, this version of it, it's pretty, but it leaves out some important information. So I'm going to do a sketch for you for this one as well. All right, so we're going to find carbons in the atmosphere. And these carbons are going to be CO2s, right? Carbon dioxide, inorganic, unavailable to living things. We are going to have another reservoir of carbon dioxides and other carbons is the oceans. And we're going to have dissolved carbon over here. We're going to have dissolved CO2. When that happens, it's actually going to form bicarbonate ion. and release hydrogens, which is going to cause acidification. Right. We're going to have some exchange between the oceans and the atmosphere just by diffusion. Right, so carbon dioxides are going to go down their concentration gradient. If there's higher concentration in the atmosphere, they'll move into the ocean. If vice versa, they'll move out. We're going to move carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the bodies of plants by the process of photosynthesis. Plants do some cellular respiration. Right? The vast majority of the movement, though, this is kind of so small compared to the photosynthesis that it's negligible. We're going to have animals, right, that are going to release carbon dioxides into the atmosphere by cellular respiration and organismal respiration. We're going to find the carbons in the bodies of plants and animals. These are going to be organic molecules. All right, so we're going to have glucoses, we're going to have amino acids, we're going to have DNA molecules, right? So we're going to have same thing we talked about before, this detritus and soil component. For the purposes of this diagram, I'm going to put them together. So we're going to have the process of death leading to the carbons from plant and animal bodies moving into the soil. All right. In the ocean, the carbons, we can also have suspended detritus in the ocean temporarily. But eventually, all of that leftover junk, dead bodies of organisms like we talked about, is going to fall down, right? So we have sedimentation as a process that forms sediment, right? So precipitation basically of stuff, floating bits of sort of all this detritus that we find in the soil in the terrestrial ecosystem. We find it floating around in the ocean. It gets to the bottom. All right. Eventually, all this stuff from land is going to get to the bottom, runoff or flow. Right. Rivers are going to drain into lakes. Lakes are going to carry this detritus, and some of the soil down into the oceans, and it will add to the sediment. All right. So when we talked about chemical processes that can occur that sort of form rock or release things from rock, we had this process where we could turn organic molecules that were mostly decomposed but present in the sediment. We can form rock with them, mineralization, right? We can mineralize that sediment. It'll turn into sedimentary rock, right? We may also find as part of this formation pockets of organic matter that lead to formation of reservoirs of fossil fuels. All right, so this would be fossilization. All right, so we could get that directly from sediment, but usually this rock step happens, or it's all smooshed together in different layers. All right, but an important part of this diagram is that these fossil fuels are going to be buried. They're going to be under the oceans, underground, as plate tectonics continue to move. And in order for us humans to use fossil fuels, we have to extract them, right? We have to pump natural gas, crude oil, we have to pump it up from the ground, right? So we have to extract it. Use a lot of energy to do this, right? And those giant things that pump the fossil fuels up from underground, or that we chip up the rocks that have coal in them. And we're going to have stored fossil fuels on the surface. Right. And then what we're going to do to them is combust them. We're going to burn them to get the energy out of them. And those are going to return carbon dioxides to the atmosphere. So the molecules that make up these fossil fuels and stored fossil fuels are called hydrocarbons, right? So hydrocarbons are going to be these molecules that are burned. So they're different than these organic molecules that we find in the bodies of animals, slightly different form of the carbon. All right, so what we're talking about is that this part of the carbon cycle, this part is extraction, right? Extraction and combustion. These are the parts that humans are doing that are causing this increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. All these other things are kind of in equilibrium, right? All these other things have been kind of in equilibrium for tens of thousands of years, not hundreds of thousands of years. What we're doing differently is that rapidly, compared to geologic time, we are bringing these fossil fuels from storage underground where they have not been part of the carbon cycle, right? So it takes a very, very long time, if at all, that these are moved back up to the surface and then burnt, right? So these are like long-term storage, and they wouldn't be part of the carbon cycle that's actually happening at the surface of the planet. We have taken them from their deep storage and we have added them back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxides, all right? So that is why we need to understand the carbon cycle in detail in order to understand why what we're doing, what we're doing as humans is causing a change to it. And also, again, where we're deforesting, we're decreasing the ability of the whole plant biomass on the planet in order to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So it's a double whammy, and we'll talk about that a little more again when we talk in person. That's the end of our lecture for today.